Michael is a researcher and also a teaching professor of computer science at the Institute for Software Research at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. And he is also director of the undergraduate software engineering minor, as well as the software engineering concentration at CMU. And his main passion, he says, is to improve the lives of developers, which I think has been a theme throughout this entire course. So it's wonderful to have you here today, Michael. And he does this by teaching students software engineering. And I can tell you that he is an amazing teacher. And I know that there's so much more that I can learn from him. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit more today about the topic that he's going to lecture on, and also just in general, how he approaches teaching. His research also, though, focuses on developers, on improving developers and development processes. And much of his research has focused on continuous integration. And he was just saying that recently he's been looking at flaky tests, because flaky tests are one of the challenges that he's noticed coming up a lot in continuous integration. And he's constantly looking for ways to find improvements for developers. So yeah, Michael, I know that today you were going to start off with your presentation on promoting human flourishing. I saw your talk mentioned on Twitter and I'm like, oh, I want that. I want my students to see that talk. So I asked you early on in the term if you would do it, and you very graciously agreed. And you gave the students some homework, but I'll hand it over to you to manage that part. And yeah, please take it away. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk a little about the homework question in line as we go. I just want to say thanks for having me here. I mean, the list of speakers you've had is like a who's who in software engineering. I would have loved to have a class like this when I was a student. So I have a little bit of imposter syndrome looking at all the people on the list. So if you feel that same way, then I do too. So don't feel bad. And there's some really amazing people, and yeah. So hopefully I can at least provide my little grain of sand to help us all learn together.
And not trying to make you blush, but you're also one of those amazing people that we have coming this term. So
well,
you belong here.
Well, even if you are a faculty at a big school, that sometimes those feelings don't go away. So I want to encourage you as students that it's the reality. When you see a list of people like that, it's hard to believe that you belong on that list sometimes. So, as you said, my name is Michael Hilton. I'm on Twitter at Michael Hilton. I think there's a lot of developers on Twitter. So if you are going to be a developer, I would encourage you to have a professional Twitter where you have a professional presence that where you can learn from other developers and see what's going on in the world of developers. I would encourage that. Obviously, you don't have to, but if you are on Twitter and you want to follow me, that'd be great. I'd be happy to follow you back. Okay, a little bit about me. I graduated from San Diego State quite some time ago. I worked for 10 years for the Department of Defense as a software engineer. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next, so I went and got a master's degree, and then after that, I went and got a PhD from Oregon State University, and I'm a teaching professor at Carnegie Mellon. I don't have time to talk about why being a teaching professor is the best job in the world today, but if you're interested in that story, contact me and we can talk about that some other time. So what is human flourishing? So this is what we're talking about today, is software development for the sake of human flourishing, right? So there's a lot of definitions out there. This is a definition that comes from Harvard. They have a Center for Human Flourishing, and I like this, that they have 5 central domains: happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. So if we want to promote human flourishing, this is one definition of what that might look like, right? Why does this matter, right? So, this at the beginning of a talk is always good to have kind of a motivation for what you're doing. And I think that we can, there's a lot of different people in the world, and we come with a lot of different perspectives and a lot of backgrounds, and we don't all have to have the same motivation for why we think these things are important. But here are some motivations that might apply to you, or you might find relevant, right? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is kind of at the beginning of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Actually, this was drafted by a Canadian, I found out when I was doing some research for today's lecture, or at least one of the main drafters. In our country, we have the Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, right? That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And while I fully acknowledge that at some points and at many points in our history, that has been more aspirational than reality for a lot of people, there's still this kind of idea that everyone has this kind of self-evident, right? That people have dignity and value. So I threw this in just for your class today. There is the section 15 of the Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms. And it says that this exists to prevent the violation of essential human dignity, right? So there's this, and this is in the Canada versus Law. Law is a person's name, and it's some court case. And it's basically enshrining in the law that there is this essential human dignity that each person has. And maybe it's just your internal compass, like you just strongly feel from inside of you that all human beings have dignity and worth. That's a totally legitimate reason to, think these things are important. And perhaps it's part of your faith, right? So my faith has this concept of what's called imago Dei, which means that all human beings have the spark of the divine, that God has created, that there's value in each and every human being, and that one group of humans don't have more value than other humans. But whatever your reason is, I'm not asking you to agree with all of these or necessarily have exactly the same perspective on all these, but I think we should all be able to agree that human beings have dignity and worth, and that we as software developers should be creating systems and software that enhances and values humans and doesn't degrade them. And as long as you can agree with that, I think we're on a good found. So this is an interesting scandal, the Volkswagen scandal. Has anyone heard of the Volkswagen software scandal? There's a yes/no chat in the chat thing. I want to go ahead and give me a yes or a no if you have heard of this scandal or not. If you haven't, that's totally fine. I'm seeing a bunch of no's, a few yeses. Okay, so this was a case where someone from Volkswagen, basically Volkswagen was creating cars in the United States that were diesel engines, and they were trying to make clean diesel. But what they found is that the EPA, which manages the who does it is what fuel efficiency, had figured out that they tested these on like a treadmill, so they could use telemetry from the car to figure out when they were being tested, and they could change their engine modes to drastically reduce the pollution. But then when they went back out on the road, they reverted back to the regular engine modes, right? And they wrote software to do this. This software was written by an outside person that some corporate VP hired to do this. It was very clearly wrong. It was very clear that they knew what they were doing was completely unethical, illegal, immoral, etc. And they did it anyways, right? So this talk is not for those sorts of people, right? If you're going to go out there and blatantly break the law and be completely unknowingly immoral and unethical, there's not really much I can do to help you there, right? But I think if you look at the history of software and where we've gone wrong, and you all kind of came up with some great examples of that, I think many of the people who developed those systems were not intentionally trying to subvert the law and ethics and morality for their own gain. I think there have been a lot of problems in software that have really hurt a lot of people, but were done by well-meaning developers. That is kind of a little bit my thesis. And my thesis is that you as a well-meaning developer could go out in the world and unintentionally create systems which cause harm to people as well. And so the goal for this talk is to find ways to help us catch these problems before they go out and actually hurt people. But it's not to say that, we think that if someone makes a system that is problematic, that this means that they're necessarily trying to be evil, even though those people do exist, right? So there's a list of unethical concerns. If we sometimes want to do this in a longer class, I do kind of an interactive exercise around kind of things that we have found. I saw that I asked the question. I saw the Google Drive. As a professor, I thought that the pedagogy around this, about having the Google Drive and having people respond to people, was really fantastic. I thought that was a really cool idea. So I'm going to blatantly steal that for one of my next exercises, just FYI. And you came up with a lot of great things. Concerns around social media, excessive data collection, unethical business practices, addictive applications, vice deliveries, things like gambling and casinos, user abusive practices, encoding of bias, automation, replacing workers, and deep fakes. I don't have time to go into it. The automation replacing workers is super interesting, and you should look up Jevons paradox. And if we had more time, or maybe at the end, if you want to, I can come back to that. But there's a lot of really good concerns here. I have a couple. I'm going to highlight a couple concerns that I have found. That some of these I'm going to repeat actually ones that you have found, and there are others as well. This is a headline from a news article that says EA calls their loot boxes. Loot boxes are games where you can buy things that power you up, but it's random. So it's basically like gambling in a game. They said they are used ethically is the headline, right? Actually, in many parts of Europe, they're now banned because they are considered unethical, especially because they target children. So recently, Domino's in this country made it to the Supreme Court because they were trying to not have to make their website accessible to the blind. So they fortunately lost this case, and so the court ruled that ADA does actually, the Americans with Disability Act does actually apply to websites, and so websites should be accessible, which I think is a good ruling. But you know, this, I would argue there's some ethical problems with fighting it like this. Someone in the class actually mentioned this case, right? So if you, there's Mr. McConnell and Barack Obama are two American politicians, and if you put them on Twitter with these two pictures, it would crop to both of McConnell's faces and neither of Obama's cases, right? And this obviously is problematic. I think, and if you change the contrast, you see that you can get it to go to Obama over McConnell. I'm going to just throw in here as a software engineering instructor. I think the problem with this one was their test data. And if they would have had, I don't think anyone at Twitter would have let something go out the door if they had seen this before it happened. I think this was a lack of testing. And if they would have tested it with different, with these sorts of pictures, they would have seen it before it went out the door. So I don't think they wrote an algorithm that was like, let's turn racist equals on somewhere in their algorithm. But I do think they didn't test it properly, and the lack of proper testing led to a racism in their algorithm. Ryanair, which is a European carrier, got in trouble because they were figuring out people who were flying with the same last names and then randomly assigning them seats far apart from each other, so they would pay the seat upgrade fee to move back together, especially because they figured parents with children would do this because you wouldn't want your small child to be like randomly assigned into a different place in the airplane. Lime Scooter, one of these electric scooter companies where you rent the scooter by the hour, they had a problem where their app would reset, and then it would close your session, and then the theft mechanism would kick in, and it would stop your scooter hard, and people got thrown out into the street. Fortunately, this lady in Switzerland who got hurt didn't die actually, but getting thrown into traffic is a really bad thing for your users. You may have heard about the Uber self-driving car with the fatal accident with the jaywalker. I don't want to go into all of the details here or what happened. And ultimately, if there are self-driving cars, there's going to be people who die. But the concern here was, it seems from the outside, I don't have any inside information, but it seems that they had turned off the LiDAR, which is this form of radar, because they wanted to make the system cheaper to be able to scale it easier. And all the experts agree that if they had this LiDAR on, it would have detected the person. Also, there was some weirdness going on with the alerts, where they were suppressing alerts because it was making it too hard for the drivers and stuff. So that's, it's not just about putting technology out there. It's about how do you manage it when it's out there. This is a very famous algorithmic bias case in the United States where they were using this ML thing to predict defendants' scores of whether they will re-offend again or not, and this would influence their sentencing. And as you can see, the distributions were quite different, and the white defendants got much better scores than the black defendants got. And you might think, well, maybe this was bias in the sample and the white people weren't as bad as the black people or something. But actually, it gets worse, because if you look at actually the prediction, the failure rate, which is really what actually is the reality, right? If this was just, the top is just predictions, we see that they erred much more on the side of saying an African American is worse and saying a white person is better, right? So they had a lot more cases where their algorithm failed by making black people seem scarier and white people seeming less scary than they should have, right? So their errors were in the wrong directions. And these algorithmic biases affect a lot of things, right? And this is like the canonical case of engineering, right? The Therac 25. This was a bug in the software that led to at least 6 deaths. It was a radiation machine for chemo, for radiation for cancer, and this was the screen down here. But there was a refresh bug, and you could turn it where it was in like wideband X-ray mode when you thought it was just in the light aiming mode, and so people overdosed on radiation. But all outside indications were that everything was working properly. The real problem, though, is the engineers were overconfident and they removed hardware locks from a previous version because they said, well, our software will never have any problems, so we don't need these hardware locks. They took the hardware locks out, and then a bunch of people died. Right? So these are all kind of, cases of bad behavior or bad outcomes in software engineering. And this is, I'm not the first person to point this out. As you can see, there's a lot of people who say that we should consider the ethical implications of our work, right? And this has happened over and over, and lots of people have been talking about this. This is not a new topic that I'm the first person to realize, but it is an important topic. And the amount that people are talking about it, and yet the lack of progress, shows that we still have a ways to go. Well, you might be thinking, oh, isn't there a code of ethics that we should adhere to as engineers, right? And the ACM has a code of ethics, the Association for Computing Machinery. And, it's all good things. I don't have a problem specifically with their code of ethics. Unfortunately, there is some research that seems to indicate that they showed some developers code of ethics, and they ended up being less ethical after they saw the code of ethics than before they saw the code of ethics. So at the very least, it's not a silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. So they're just having this code of ethics doesn't seem to solve things, and just being aware of the code of ethics doesn't seem to really even fix the situation. So this presents us with a challenge, right? So how do we apply ethics to a field like software engineering that changes so often? So if you remember the domino example, right, this American with Disabilities Act, is that they were litigating whether that law applied to websites or not. Well, this website was that law was written in the US in 1990, which is before the first website ever existed, right? So the first websites were in 92, 93, something like that. And the wide web wasn't widespread until the late 90s. So you're taking this law that was written before the existence of the internet, before the existence of the World Wide Web at all, let alone how we use it in today's life, and trying to apply it to that, right? And there's some challenges there, and the law is notoriously slow, and it's hard to catch up. And this creates a challenge for us, right? Doctors have medical ethics, but they've been dealing with human physiology that essentially hasn't changed that much in the last thousands of years, right? Versus for us, in 30 years, everything has dramatically changed. So because of this, I don't really have any answers for you today, unfortunately. But what I do have are some questions, and I hope that these questions will provide value to you, and that as you go out into the world, you can think about, how can I ask myself these questions to make sure I'm on the right path? And this way, like if we go back and try to litigate all the details of the Uber self-driving car thing, in 5 to 10 years, there's probably going to be some other new technology that's wildly different. And so trying to navigate all the specifics of that example is, I don't know how helpful that is. But I do think having a series of questions that you can ask yourselves, perhaps these answers to these questions will change over time. But these are questions that I came up with that I think are helpful, and I'd like to present them to you. So the first question is, does my software respect the humanity of the users? Right. So I have some tools that I think could help you with that and help you answer this question. So there's this humane design guide, and I'll be happy to post these slides or make them available after the talk. But there's this humane design guide where you can look at these human sensitivities, such as emotional, attentional, sense-making, decision-making, social reasoning, group dynamics. And then for each of these, here's an example of attention, right? It talks a little about things that inhibit it, what inhibits it, what makes people feel supported, and then you can rate your project as to how much opportunity to improve you have in this domain. And then it kind of walks you through these different facets of your of human sensitivities and helps you focus on the confluence of human sensitivities and your application, and helps you think about places where there might be areas of concern or areas for improvement. And once you have that, then there's a little checklist of things you can do from there. It's a really nice little tool. I know I saw you talk to
Anita.
Anita was here, you talked to Oregon State, right? I know she's a big part of the Gender Mag effort. So if you might have heard a little bit about this already, but I think things like this, right, that are tools to help you. Gender Mag doesn't give you the answers. It doesn't say, well, you should do this or that, right? But it says, here's a process. Go through this process. Ask yourself these questions. Think about how someone like Abby could use your system. How are you designing your system to support someone like Abby, right? And now there's a whole host of other people, right? And I think when you design a system using things like Gender Mag, you're really respecting the humanity of the users, especially users that might not look exactly like you, right? And so kind of that's what Gender Mag is for. And there's this whole kind of thing to go through with how you walk through a Gender Mag walkthrough. But this gives you an opportunity to give you a process, something you can actually do to think about who these other users are and how you can be respectful to them. Ultimately, this is kind of what user-centered design is all about, right? So the user-centered design tries to optimize the product about what the users can want or need, as opposed to just making users accommodate the product, right? So this is a thread that kind of goes through computing. People have thought about some of these things before. Even as a big software engineering guy, I have to talk about the Agile Software Development Manifesto. It's in the contract, but it talks about customer collaboration over contract negotiation, right? We should see customers as our collaborators, people that we're working with, not people that we're just trying to get the most advantageous contract that we can. Question 2, right? Does my software amplify a positive or negative behavior for users and for society at large? And I think this is really important. This is kind of where we start to get into a lot of the ML stuff, right? There's these tools like Lime, which helps you identify, give explanations for your models, right? This is a classic example of there was this model that was trained on these 2 news groups and was predicting whether it came from an atheism news group or a Christianity news group. And it did really, really well, but turns out it was predicting based on the headers because they used different remailers for their HTTP. For their email clients and not actually on the contents of the letters, right? And so by thinking about what is the context and what your data is training on, this can really help you be acutely aware of what you're actually amplifying, right? So there's also tools like this what if, where you can go and inspect something, right, and to see, well, what are the predictions being based on, right? Are we making these? Someone brought up the Amazon thing where they famously kind of had this kind of disaster where they would for hiring, if it was a male resume, it would get bumped up a lot. If it was a female resume, it would get bumped down, right? Because they were dealing with historical data, and that's what it learned from their historical data, right? And kind of this is not really an ethical problem, but it's kind of a humorous example of this, right? There's this kind of a classic example in a paper where there's a dog versus wolf classifying, and it turns out that it was actually classifying the snow in the background and not the actual animal, right? And when we get into these sorts of situations, right, you can really here, it's basically amplifying the background, not the foreground, right? And so you can build these classifiers, release them into the wild, and end up amplifying something that you didn't inspect. And sometimes it's kind of humorous like this, but sometimes it actually hurts real people. Explaining why, I think, is important. And if you can't explain why to your customers, then you can't explain why to yourself. This is an ad for Facebook, and it explains to me that it's because it's people between the ages of 22 to 64 and who live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right? And so if you can explain to your customer why you're showing them this, then you can know for yourself, and you know what you're amplifying and what sorts of behavior you're encouraging, right? There's this good resource from Anil Dash on how to prevent abuse on your if you have like some sort of a forum or something like that. I don't have time to read through them all. I'll leave them there. But if you're not proactively taking steps to prevent abuse of your users, the abuse will happen, right? And so you really need to think of abuse as something that you should, if you ever develop a system that has any sort of community associated with it, you should really start by building in the abuse prevention, as opposed to waiting until it happens and then, adding that feature later on. This is something I found recently, this thing called Dion. It's a checklist for what are you doing in your software. This is specifically more for data scientists, but a lot of the checklist stuff applies to software engineering as well. And I think that it has some cool things. So you recommend to look at that. And then lastly, my friend just stood this up last week. It's an AI incident database. And I think this is a really useful tool because, if we don't, as the infamous quote goes, right, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And so I think part of being a responsible engineer is acquainting yourself with what are the things that have happened in the past and how can you avoid those mistakes in the future. So last point here, we're kind of running on, I'm kind of speeding up a little bit because I want to make sure we end on time and be respectful of the next presenter. But, we're talking about will the software quality affect the humanities of others? And so, software quality has long been considered, this is from the Wikipedia on quality attributes for software. I'm not going to go into each and every one of these. You can take whole classes on software quality. But I do think I kind of take a little bit more of a meta approach here and talk a little bit about professional ethics. So the first three professions are divinity, law, and medicine. This is kind of historically viewed as the first three professions. And I'm not going to really talk about divinity. That's the study of religion, because that's kind of a study of ethics in and of itself. But I'm going to talk a little bit about medicine versus law. So medicine has this intrinsic oath where you take the Hippocratic Oath, you do no harm. A lot of people think this comes from the Greeks. It really comes from after World War II, when the Nazi doctors were experimenting and the whole medical community kind of recoiled and shuddered and came up with this approach of having this Hippocratic Oath. But it's a very intrinsic motivation versus the law is a very extrinsic motivation, right? You defend your client the best you can, but the bar regulates behavior, and you just give an oath to follow the rules, but it's not about being inside of you. And a lot of people, I think, would feel that medicine has maybe stronger ethics than law. I think there's a perception that doctors are more ethical than lawyers. And I think a lot of that comes from the perception that intrinsic motivation is stronger than extrinsic motivation. Why am I bringing this up? Well, I think we don't have anything like this in software engineering, and I'm proposing that perhaps we should have something like this. And what would it look like to have something like malpractice in software engineering, right? So not every mistake is malpractice. And generally for malpractice to exist, there should be demonstrated harm, but also professional standards should be violated, right? So if I'm walking down the road and I see someone who is in a car crash and I go to try to help them and I actually end up hurting them, then that's not malpractice, because I don't know all the professional standards of what a doctor should provide care for. But if a doctor comes along the line and knows what they should do and they end up hurting the person, violating professional standards, then that could be actual malpractice, right? In software, though, you can't have malpractice if you don't have any professional standards, right? And we really don't have professional standards in software. And so there's really no such thing as malpractice in software, right? And maybe there should be, right? Does not having CI constitute malpractice? Does not having any unit tests? Does shipping a model that you don't have no explanation for, right? If you start thinking about what this could look like, I think this is a really interesting question to consider. Does anybody know what this is? You can throw it in the chat if you know what this is. Yes, so I have been told that this is a thing in Canada, right? These iron rings that supposedly engineers wear, right? And you supposed to wear it on your drafting hand, and it's supposed to remind you of ethics, right? Because supposedly they came from a bridge that collapsed, and then they used the metal, allegedly, I think, to do this. And there's kind of this whole ceremony around this, right? And we don't have anything like that in this country at all, like a professional engineering society.
If I can jump in a little bit, Michael.
Yep.
So I think most of the undergrads in this class are in our software engineering program, which is an accredited program. And there are, they're going to be, most of them, professional engineers. So
I think that is super cool. And I think that, this is not a slide I put in here for you as a Canadian audience. This is a slide that I give to everyone. And I point out that in the United States, we don't have anything like this. And I think that it would behoove us. And honestly, I apologize for my kind of lack of understanding of what professional engineering in Canada looks like. But I think in America, we should, or in the US at least, we should have this concept of some sort of professional engineering or association. Now, it is a little tricky. A lot of, in the US, the fields that have professional engineers, it's usually about who do you sue if something goes wrong. And so, does it make sense to have one person signing off on all the changes that are made to Gmail? I don't know that necessarily makes sense, but I do think there's a little bit more of kind of a sense of professional standards that go along with kind of this. There's a physical manifestation of this in Canada that we don't have in this country that I think is disappointing.
To chime in, we do have professional software engineers that I know of. There's almost none in industry. A huge proportion of them are literally the profs teaching it because they have to. And besides like aerospace and medical, where are you going to put them? I had one prof who was teaching testing, and it's not the ethics one, but his big thing was just like, okay, how do you test an entire software stack? Like, you can't have 0 failures in software because everything moves. You can't have 0 failures anywhere, but the idea of standards, like you have to try in a sense, but how do you quantify trying? Like, don't, what was the Toyotas was really bad when they messed up the pedal thing. That was just really, really bad. The Uber one, part of it was that they changed out the system so it would wait 1 second before braking because it was false positing too much and their person wasn't looking at the road. So it's just really, really difficult to quantify software because there's just too many layers of stacking on yourself.
I totally agree. Plus, there's no professional standards. So, right. So there's no like standards that says, oh, you should have X amount of unit code coverage to, there's standards for like building bridges. Like my grandpa built bridges. So this is one thing I'm a little bit familiar with. Right. And there's standards around like, if you're building a bridge, you should follow these processes. You should get this approvals. You should do these things. And we don't really have that in software by and large. Now, maybe sometimes when they intersect with other industries, they end up borrowing the standards from that industry, right? So like you said, if you're in aerospace, you borrow the standards from aerospace for the systems you're developing. But, like these Lime scooters, these are scooters that are throwing people out into traffic based on software that's running on an app. What are the professional standards around the software that is written on this app, right? There's no like standard of testing or evaluation or any sort of professionality around the development of this app that is standardized across the industry wide. Now, I'm not trying to intentionally blame those engineers. I don't think they were trying to do a bad job, but there's no thing to point to that says, well, look you didn't have 80% test coverage. So that means you weren't really being professional. Right. And I think that we're still kind of fast moving, and this has allowed us to do a lot of things, but I just want to point out that there's downsides to this too. And I think that if you are going to be a professional engineer, or if you are in a situation where you have the opportunity to pursue this, right, what does it mean to be a professional engineer to you, and what does it mean for you to be professional? I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, just because there's some regulation somewhere doesn't mean that you're going to do the right thing. Someone in the chat was saying that they said there's an ethics class that they feel like is more intrinsic, right? And I do think that by and large, intrinsic motivation is stronger and more appropriate than extrinsic motivation. I don't think external regulation is the answer here. I think, hopefully you going out into the world will behave in a professional manner because you have the intrinsic, desire to be professional and to do things right and think about, what potential mistakes you're making. I mean, this is one of the huge concerns I have. So there's like a couple big ideas that are concerns. Let me see. I think I have, okay, I'll wrap up here and then I'll take a couple questions. But I think these questions are the start of the conversation, but as the technology is evolving, we must be vigilant to ensure that we are promoting human flourishing. And for me, there's a couple things that I kind of am worried and concerned about. And one is kind of this whole machine learning thing that we're just deploying all these systems in the world that are encoding all these biases that we don't really understand what they're doing. And we just kind of hope that everything turns out okay. And the other thing is that, when I went to college years ago, I had a professor who very explicitly said, well, there's, safety critical systems, and then there's everything else, right? And if you're not building a nuclear reactor or a pacemaker, then if there's an error, you reboot, you give the person their quarterback and they play their quarterback, and then they play your video game again, and it's all fine and well, right? That was what we were taught, right? But now we have this world where, I mean, if we had a little more time, one activity I like to do is to think about taking out your phone, look at the apps on your phone. How many of those apps have some sort of interface with the real world that could cause some person harm, right? And I don't mean like emotional harm. I mean like actual, real, physical, like literally burn your house down, crash these sorts of things, right? People have apps in their cars, in their stoves, in their heating systems, in their, in all these industrial systems, right? And these sorts of things are not being vetted through some sort of like safety critical systems by and large. By and large, they're just apps that, maybe Apple kind of runs some unit tests on them or something. But these are not, this is something that concerns me as a software engineer. How are we, don't even get me started on voting machines in the United States, which are just an absolute disaster, right? And the amount of lack of security that goes into them is horrific. So, I think that what does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean to think about the quality of the software that you're doing for users? I think are really, really important. So I think we have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions that people have they want to ask verbally or type it in?
Yeah, Matt had a couple of comments and Derek did as well. Matt, did you have a question or was that more of a comment?
It's more of a comment. The one about regulating engineers.
Yeah.
Yeah. My comment was that in other professions, people will be can be disciplined if they're cutting corners. And that's usually like as judged by some committee of their peers of engineers, because it's a self-regulating profession in BC anyway. I don't see why the same thing can't be done for software, but it is like software is more complicated, I think. And it's not just because there's lots of moving pieces. There's that in mechanical as well, but it's more a lot of software is automating business processes. And if the business processes themselves are problematic to start with, and that's not something that, I mean, there's more problems than just cutting corners. So
I agree. I think that sort of maybe some sort of a professional standards body, I think is necessary, but not sufficient, right? I don't think that's going to fix all of the problems, but I do think it would be a positive step forward to have some sort of, we as an industry say, this is how good it should be. And if you're not doing it this well, then that's malpractice, right? Mm-hmm. And currently there is nothing like that to my knowledge.
Can I ask a question, Peggy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Michael, so we have never met, and I'm here at UVic with Peggy. And but shouldn't that be the responsibility of the deployer of the software and not the developer of the software? The same way that we probably have many techniques in medicine that probably will never be approved, but somebody developed them and they're out there, and it's not the development of the technique, but the use of the technique that is really problematic. And then the second is more actually a comment for you. As Isaac Asimov talked about these issues in the 50s, right? He talks about his laws of robotics, and essentially his stories about the contradictions that we get into when we start to have ethical standards for what software has to do, or in his case, what robots have to do. And I think that we're moving in that direction where there is no clear guidance in terms of what would be the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think your comment is spot on. I totally agree. I guess this talk is my attempt at a call to arms that we should come up with some sort of standards. There's bioethicists have some pretty good standards that I've looked at that I think there's some interesting things there. But yeah, I guess this is exactly what I'm saying. Yes, we need those standards. And going back to your first question, this is challenging right now with DevOps. The developers are deploying them, right? Anybody can push anything to AWS that they want to. It's available to the whole world. That line gets very blurred.
The developers don't have agency. The organizations that hire that are the ones that give them agency. So it's the agents that make the decisions, the ones that have to be held responsible. The developer can say, no, I don't want to work there.
Interesting.
That's an interesting question, right? How much agency do you have? A lot of, at least in the, my comments are very US centric, and I apologize for that. I don't know a lot about Canada, but in the US, we don't have a lot of unions in software, but part of this is because there's a lot of agency, right? And there's a lot of kind of self-governing organizations is a famous thing, and a lot of flat organizations. And there's a lot of software teams that would, at least on paper, tell you that no one tells them what to do, and they get to self-organize, self-decide what to do. And I don't know that if we get to a world where everyone's changes have to be approved by some central person at the company is necessarily a step in the right direction either. you know, it's tricky. It's hard, right? So everyone's pushing all these changes everywhere all the time. It's the wild, wild west, right? It's super willy-nilly. Everybody can kind of you just do whatever you can, and people are inventing new technologies. We don't have established guidelines on how you use these technologies. And there's just a lot of confusion. I guess this is just to kind of, this is why I spent a lot of time thinking about this talk. And this is why I only give questions, not answers in this talk, right? Because I don't think there are any answers that will stand the test of time, really, in terms of the technology is evolving so quickly, right? So this is why I'm just hopefully giving you some questions to ask yourselves as new technology arises. The questions will continue to be beneficial, right? But there's a lot of really tricky issues here. There's a lot of, as Daniel brings up, like all your points are incredibly valid, that these are tricky and challenging, and I don't think there's easy answers, but I think they're worth wrestling with. I think they're important questions, and I think that we as developers have a huge amount of power in society, but we also have a huge amount of responsibility. I don't want to be super corny, but as Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so I think that we should be cognizant of that, and we should be thinking explicitly about how we can use our power for good and to help humanity, and not either intentionally for evil or even unintentionally in ways that are going to hurt people unintentionally.
Wow, that's some great observations. I really like the set of questions that you have, and I think that you do point to some actionable, ways, sort of concrete ways of addressing them. We're almost actually, we are kind of technically at the end of our time, but we'll just sneak a couple of minutes out of the break here. Derek, did you want to ask your question about the accountable identities and their transparency? Did you want to ask about that? It's sort of a little related to Daniel's question, perhaps.
Sure, yeah. So we had an earlier workshop that talked about the benefits of being able to hide your identity for minority individuals. So are your accountable identities also transparent, or can you create a system where you can have it under some pseudonym but still be accountable?
I mean, overall, I guess I'll take a meta step back and I'll try to answer your question. The step back, I think, is what I've hopefully presented today are processes. And so I think that the questions like these are really, really difficult to give a straight answer to without kind of a full set of context, right? So what is this forum for? What is the context of these identities? How much trust is going to be placed on other people's identities in this situation, right? And there's a lot of kind of factors that go into these. And I think that there's a lot of trade-offs to be made here. And so I don't necessarily think there is a canonical right or wrong answer to a question like this. I will say anecdotally that it seemed like 5 to 10 years ago, everyone said that seemed like Facebook came out with this big thing. Well, everybody has to use their real identity. And this was going to like solve all of the problems on the internet, because once people use their real identities, we wouldn't have people yelling at each other, and all of the like problems on the internet would go away. And I don't think that just really happened. Just, in retrospect, I could have told them that if they had been to one of my extended family gatherings where everyone knew everyone's identity and they were still screaming at each other, that just knowing someone's identity doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to treat them with kindness and respect all the time. I think that there is, there also are legal and other sorts of ramifications sometimes with accounts. So I don't have a strong answer for you, but I do think that just forcing everyone to use their true identity doesn't seem like it's really been that helpful or that successful of a strategy in general. So I would be very open to the idea of not using real identities, because it seems like the real identity thing hasn't worked at all, honestly.
Thanks for that question, Derek. And thanks, Michael. This was a really great presentation. I wish that I could hear more from you about why you said that being a teaching professor is the best job. But I can guess that part of the reason might be because you do get to impact how developers of tomorrow think. I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that as we close out here, but this was great.
I mean, I love interacting with people. I love kind of having, I don't want to say anything negative to act like, I do research. I don't want to act like researchers don't affect tomorrow, but I feel like the delta you can make in someone's lives as their instructor is greater than the delta you can make as a researcher who provides another grain of sand of evidence to the scientific corpus out there. That's my personal perspective, and I don't mean to impugn anyone who is more research focused, but that's kind of why I think teaching professors is the best job in the world. And yeah, I'm happy to talk to anyone ever about that. If you are, especially if you're a PhD student and you're considering your options of career choices, please send me an email, reach out to me, DM me on Twitter or whatever, and I'd be happy to set up some time to chat with you about kind of this. It's also not very well known, and it's a not very established career trajectory for a lot of people. So it's hard to get into, and there's not a lot of mentoring for it. This is why I'm kind of giving this kind of blank check for any sort of mentoring in that direction, because it is challenging to get into sometimes, but it's a really rewarding and fantastic career, I think.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking time out of I guess it's your Thanksgiving weekend, and coming and joining us on the other side of the country. This was fantastic. I'm really, feel really grateful that you came and presented, and that you looked at the examples that the students prepared on non-flourishing software. Were you surprised by any of those, or that they put there?
I thought they did a really good job. There was a couple of more examples I already had in my talk that they had found that we had arrived together at the same ones. I think that the one I wish I had more time to talk about is the impact of automation on workers in the workforce. I think that's a very, very interesting one. I don't think it's super clear cut what the answer is yet. And I would love to have a further discussion if time were to allow, but I think it's good that people are thinking about the impact, not only the immediate impact of like quality and that, but like the societal and larger impacts the system will cause on the system of systems that is the society that we live in. I think at least thinking about that is a really important thing to think about. So that kind of surprised me, but in a positive way, that I thought that it showed that people were thinking deeply about this and not just kind of going for the low hanging fruit of, Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Michael.